Well, I have had a wonderful time today, and I'm sure that Dr. Pettit will say his own greeting to you, but thank you for having us today, and I especially enjoyed the time with your wonderful pastor and his family. There are many stories I could probably tell you about your pastor, so if you want some ammunition, we can talk after the service tonight. But Pastor, it's been a delight to reconnect with you and to see what God is doing here through your ministry. Thank you for the privilege of preaching from your pulpit tonight. I'm going to ask you to take your Bibles to the book of Philippians, chapter 1. And in the brief time that we have together, I would like for us to look at the back end of chapter 1 and notice something that the Apostle Paul comments on in relationship to the church at Philippi with a view to how this ought to mark our own church. Those of us who have pastored churches and been a part of communities of faith like this one know that at the very root of our heart is a desire that our church would model what we see in the New Testament. And so when you come to a paragraph like the one we're going to look at, the question that we have as we look at a paragraph like this is simply this: what is it that the Apostle Paul, and really that the head of the church through the pen of Paul, is saying to us as a church, and how do we bring it about in our own ministry? So let's begin reading, if you will, in verse 27, and then we'll come back and ask ourselves the question, how do we become people who are marked by whatever it is that the Apostle Paul notes here in this paragraph? Paul says to the church at Philippi, "Only let your conversation be as becometh the gospel of Christ." Now let's stop for a moment there and notice the word conversation, and note in our minds that we're talking here about a way of life. It's not just what we say with our mouth. Oftentimes when we talk about conversation, we're primarily thinking in terms of what we would say to one another. But in essence, what the Apostle Paul is doing here is he's going beyond our words, and he's talking about our walk. He's saying, let your walk as a congregation, and that's the second thing we want to make sure that we pick up. Paul isn't talking just to individual believers. He's actually talking to the church itself. And he's saying to that whole congregation that your walk, your life as a congregation ought to be something that becomes the gospel of Christ. That whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs. And then here's what he says: that you would stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. He notes here that living in the culture and where they have been placed and in the providence of God, this is a congregation that has been called to labor together in advancing the gospel, and he immediately points out that this process is going to involve what we talked about this morning. It is going to involve doing it in a hostile context. Hence the idea of striving together for the faith of the gospel. And then in verse 28, he says to them, "And in nothing terrified by your adversaries, which is to them an evident token of perdition, but to you of salvation and that of God. For unto you it is given in behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now hear to be in me." And so the question that I would like for us to consider briefly tonight is this: how does a church like this one, how does a church like the one I am a part of and the one that you are a part of, how does a church like this one become a congregation of believers that are energized together in their walk for Christ so that they are actually advancing the gospel together the way that the Apostle Paul describes here? And I think we could come up with a lot of ways to answer that question. I was sort of smiling when Pastor Whitmer talked about somebody preaching a sermon on a tree. And I started thinking in my mind, if I were going to preach a sermon on a tree, what would I say about a tree that could be sort of edificational to people who were thinking about a tree? Could I talk about its tallness? Could I talk about its leafiness? Could I talk about its fruitfulness? And all of a sudden, you're starting to think up of ideas that you could say about a tree and then try to figure out how to make some kind of biblical application from whatever it was you thought up. And so when we talk about how does a church become a church that is energized by a walk that is advancing the gospel, and we just start thinking up our own ideas, we can come up with a lot of ways to do that. So the question in a conference on expositional preaching is there anything in this text that would tell us what Paul is actually thinking that will help a church become like this? And so what I'd like to do tonight is look at three things that I think we find at the front end of the chapter that lay out a foundation so that by the time the Philippian believers get to verse 27, they already know how to do this. In other words, we read the end of the chapter, and now we're going to go back and find out what Paul has been saying that will help them to actually be a congregation whose walk is one that advances the gospel of Jesus Christ there at Philippi. So let's begin by looking at the first thing that Paul calls to their attention. If you want to be a congregation at Philippi that is going to advance the gospel in your walk, then the first thing that has to happen is you have to cultivate relationships that are centered on the gospel. You have to cultivate relationships that are centered on the gospel. You say, well, Brother Sam, where in the world did Paul talk about that in the text? Well, go back to verse 3. Paul said this, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Always in every prayer of mine for all of you, making requests with joy. And here's what he is so thankful for when he thinks about the Philippians. In other words, every time Paul goes to pray, one of the things that is on his prayer list is this congregation of believers. So there does seem to be, in the Apostle Paul's life and ministry, an intentionality to his praying. And when he comes to pray, there are certain things that he prayed for regularly, and one of the requests had to do with this congregation. And he makes the observation that every time I think about you in my praying for you, there is great joy that comes in my heart because of you. And then he says, now here's what creates that joy when I pray for you. When I'm thinking about you and calling your name out as a congregation of the Lord, what brings great joy to me is this fellowship, in verse 5, that we've had in the gospel from the first day until now. Now think about the word fellowship for a moment. And think about how we typically use that word. Usually when we talk about fellowship in our context, it happens after church, or it happens before church, and it happens in the lobby, or it happens in the aisles, or we have a time of fellowship, or we get together for fellowship, or we have a church fellowship, and usually it happens over food. And some of the best fellowship you can ever happen or you can ever enjoy involves coffee, ice cream, and pie. That's the best kind of biblical fellowship you can ever have. But that's not what the Apostle Paul has in mind when he uses the word fellowship here. Think of the word fellowship, and in your mind, put this word in play: partnership. Paul is actually talking about a partnership that he and this congregation have enjoyed from the very first day until now. In other words, this is a gospel partnership that has been long-standing and consistent in the life of their friendship. Paul says, from the very beginning, when I came to Philippi and began to announce the gospel, and God began to work in the hearts of people at Philippi, and God began to establish a church there, from the very beginning until now, we have enjoyed a long-standing partnership in the gospel, and this partnership is one that has been maintained by God. Notice the next verse in verse 6, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. What's the good work that Paul is immediately calling to mind? It is this partnership that they enjoy with Paul in the gospel. Now here's the interesting thing. When we read our New Testament and we start tracing the steps of the Apostle Paul, there is no doubt that this man was consumed with actively and intentionally sharing the gospel with the people that came across his path. And all you have to do is read the book of Acts, and you can see that every time the Apostle Paul came somewhere, it wasn't long before he was sharing the gospel in some meaningful way, and God was attending that ministry with power. Here's the part that sometimes we miss. Paul wasn't the only one doing that. Here in Philippi, there is a congregation who is partnering with Paul in this ministry, and they have been doing it for a long time, and God has been sustaining them in that partnership. And then Paul says this is a partnership that is at the center, it is at the heart of our relationship. It is what produces such sweet fellowship. Notice what he says in verse 7. Even as it is meet for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart. Inasmuch as both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers of my grace. For God is my record, how greatly I long after you all in the bowels of Jesus Christ. He's talking here about the most intimate and the deepest of affections that one person can have for another community of believers. Now, here's what I want to ask you to think about tonight. How is it that this depth of friendship, not just this partnership, but this deep affection, how is it that this deep affection developed between a former Pharisee and a group of people who were complete idolaters before they came to Christ? I mean, think about the foundational incompatibility that would have been ingrained in Paul from his youth up when it came to associating with pagan idolaters. I mean, if you asked a rabbi why God created Gentiles, they would basically tell you that God created Gentiles in certain quarters of them. Not all of them would say this, but some of them would say God created Gentiles because he needed fuel for hell's fire. I mean, what happened that would take a former Pharisee and put him in such tender affection toward a group of people like the Philippians? And the only common ground that they have is what? The gospel. Now, I want you to stop and think about what bonds all of you together in this building. I mean, here you are on a Sunday night. And all you have to do is walk into your church and you can tell that for the most part there is tender affection between you. I mean, I sat in the back and watched you. I watched you talk to each other. I watched you this morning. I watched you and I felt that affection as a relative stranger to your congregation. There is no question that in this building there are people who love each other. Now, if we sat down for a minute and everybody could sort of just talk and just tell what your background is, what you would discover is that probably there is far more differences than there would be similarities between you. If you think about where you came from and what happened to you and where you were born and what you came out of, and here's somebody else and they came out of this, and think about all of the things that in a common, ordinary environment, there would be far more differences that would tend to polarize you than what would bring you together. So what explains the tender affection that exists among a group like this that is diverse as this one is? I was warned about making sure I said New Ark this morning, because the uninitiated might stumble into problems if they pronounce that the wrong way, the way that you would normally think of when you saw that word. So what is it that would cause a person from Newark to come to New Ark and find this level of fellowship and acceptance and affection? And the answer is there's only one thing, and it's the gospel. So the first thing that has to happen in a church that is really going to fulfill Paul's desire to be a congregation whose body life is marked in a way that advances the gospel is they're going to have to recognize and celebrate that what brought them all together, what establishes their relationship together as a congregation, is the gospel that brought them to Christ. I remember the first time this really hit me was when I was pastoring in Milwaukee, and God had been blessing that congregation, and people were being saved, and God was transforming people. I mean, I have seen times, and I've been involved in places where God has been at work, but there was just an unusual season where God was at work in people's lives, and people were hearing the gospel, and people that we were witnessing to were getting saved, and not only people we were witnessing to, but people that we didn't even know were coming in and being saved. And I remember walking as our church began to experience the joy of that. Because there is a joy when people are genuinely saved. I mean, I can remember times when we would have baptismal services, and here were 5 or 10 adults, and they would get up and they would give their testimony, and they would talk about how they heard the gospel and how somebody in our congregation had ministered to them or reached them, and they had been saved, and now they're standing up in front of an entire congregation and getting saved, and you're realizing, you know what? That person is very different than me. That person has a whole different set of experiences. That person has a whole different background. That person has a whole different outlook on life. And they have just been born into the same body that I'm a part of. There's a great joy in that. But there are growing pains that come with that. And I remember walking from my car in the church as we were getting ready to come into a service, and here are cars all in our parking lot, and it was election year, sort of like the one we're going into. And I remember walking by cars that had stickers for the Democratic candidate and bumper stickers for the Republican candidate. Now, you don't put a sticker on your car unless you feel strongly about it. I mean, think about a $15,000 to $20,000 piece of machinery, and you're going to stick something on it. You're not going to stick something on your car that you really don't believe in. And so I'm walking by in our Baptist church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm walking by people that stuck stuff on their car, and I'm thinking, you know what? This could be a very interesting congregation. Because there are belief systems and there are worldviews that apparently are very much at odds, but you come into our church and what brought all of those people together was what? A common gospel. And it was the starting place for deep affection that began to develop in that congregation. And Paul says, you know what? This is where it starts. If you're going to be a congregation that ministers in a way, that lives body life in a way that becometh the gospel of Christ, here is where it starts. The foundational thing that brings you all together is this common partnership that began and is being sustained by God when He brought the gospel into your life. And when He opened your eyes and caused you to see that the glory of God really is demonstrated and displayed fully in the face of Jesus, and you embraced Him. Now, it doesn't end there. That's where it starts. Notice the second thing that Paul talks about. It's not just that we must cultivate relationships that are founded on the gospel. Secondly, we must display lives that are being transformed by the gospel that unites us. It's not just that we have a common bond in the gospel, it's that we have a common experience. And the common experience is the gospel that we have embraced has begun to change us. And what is unifying us now, what is bringing our lives even more deeply together, is the growth that is coming because of the gospel. And you can see this in the next section, beginning in verse 9. Paul says, "And this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment, that ye may approve things that are excellent, that ye may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ unto the glory and praise of God." So now we have a common experience. We have a common foundation, the gospel. that brings us together in a relationship as a body, but now we have a common experience. And the common experience is simply this: the gospel that brought us together is a gospel that is beginning to grow us together so that we look more and more like Christ. And you can see this pattern beginning to develop. We are growing in our ability to love. And you can see that in verse 9. Paul says, I am praying for you, and when I pray, I am praying that God will cause your love to abound more and more. This is your love for God. This is your love for each other, that your capacity to love will grow. Here's an illustration that maybe will help us to kind of grasp what Paul has in mind. This December, my wife and I will celebrate 29 years of marriage. And I'm very thankful for that. And I didn't say that to get an applause. I mean, if anybody ought to get an applause, it's Beth. But I am very thankful. And some of you have been married. How many of you have been married at least 29 years? Can I see your hands? All right. Many of you in this room have been married at least that many years, and some of you more than that. So you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. When I go back to the day I got married, I remember getting married in the state of Florida, and I stood there in front of a congregation full of people, a church full of people, and I made some vows to the woman that is now my wife. And if you had caught me on the day of my wedding and said to me, Sam, let me ask you a question. How much do you love Beth? What do you think I would have told you? I would have said, I love her with all of my what? With all of my heart. And I would have meant it. If I could go back 29 years in time and stand before you, I would be telling you on that day that I loved Beth with the full capacity that I could love her 29 years ago. But if you ask me today, how much do you love Beth? I'm going to tell you I love her with all of my heart. And I look back on that statement 29 years ago and say, you know what? I don't know how to explain this to you, but whatever that was, I just had such a small capacity, and God has grown my capacity to love my wife. And I think on a very, very small human level, that's a small picture of what Paul's praying here, that as a congregation, not just individually, but together as a congregation, as you begin to grow in the gospel begins to grow your capacity to love each other. It grows your capacity to love God. And that growth in love, that growth in your ability to love God is not just a blind devotion. It's actually a very informed devotion. You grow in spiritual understanding and insight. You can see that really at the end of verse 9, that you would abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment. The word judgment is the word for discernment. That as the gospel begins to grow in you, and as the gospel begins to grow you, you grow in your capacity to love, and really that love begins to display itself in discernment, so that you are living a life that reflects who you really love. And that ultimately is reflected in a spiritual maturity and vitality that looks like this. It is a love that allows you, this discernment allows you to make choices that reflect what is excellent, so that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ unto the glory and praise of God. So Paul says, now, if you want to be a congregation whose body life, whose walk together is a walk that adorns the gospel, that makes the gospel attractive in appropriate ways, that advances the gospel, here's where it begins. It begins with a cultivation of the relationship that you have together as a body on the ground of the gospel. And that relationship that you have together that is built on the gospel is a relationship that has a common experience. You are growing together because of the gospel in your ability to love God and reflect His character in your life. You are displaying lives that are being transformed by the gospel. The longer you are a believer, the more your life ought to reflect the glory of the gospel and the power of the gospel to transform a life. And that brings us to the final thing. And I think Paul is actually driving here. He starts with a common foundation, the gospel. He builds on a common shared experience, growing together in the gospel so that our lives are being transformed. And he sort of comes to this third and final piece, and he says, now, if you're going to be a congregation that is really advancing the gospel, you are going to have common priorities that are set by the gospel. You're going to have to look at life as a congregation, and your life is going to have to be viewed through the lens of what God is doing in your congregation to advance the gospel. You're going to have congregational priorities that are set around the gospel. You say, well, where in the world does he say that? Well, look at verse 12. Paul says, I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather under the furtherance of the gospel. Paul's saying, look, when you hear what you are hearing about me, I want you to see it through this lens. I want you to see it through the lens that this is, in the eyes of an all-wise God, the best possible way to advance the gospel. This thing that you're hearing about, in God's providence, is the best way to advance the gospel. Well, what thing are you talking about? Look at verse 13. So that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. So what's the result? Many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preach Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. You know, when you think about the Apostle Paul's life and you think of the incredible things that happened when he came to Philippi, or when he went to Ephesus, or when he showed up at Corinth, the last thing that you would do if you were a strategist for the gospel is lock him up in a prison cell. Because every time you loose Paul and you put him in a city, the whole city hears the gospel. So when you read this, it doesn't make sense, does it, that he would say, look, the bonds that you are hearing, and here I am in a prison cell. I am actually a prisoner for the sake of the gospel. He has to actually talk to the church and help them to adjust their thinking. And what he says to them is, this is the very best way for God to advance the gospel. It's because of my bonds that the gospel got to the very highest places in Caesar's household. I would never, in freedom, have had the opportunity to share the gospel to those people. And not only that, there are people who are hearing about this who are becoming themselves emboldened to preach the gospel. Now, all of this is great, isn't it, when we hear about it in the Apostle Paul's life? So let me end with a story and an application as we wrap up here in the final minutes before we pray. Dr. Pettit mentioned trial that God brought into their family, and many of you have had that same trial in your own life in some capacity or another. That trial came to our family in 2007 when Beth, my wife, was diagnosed with a very aggressive case of breast cancer. In fact, I remember coming together as a church family, and Dr. Pettit was our staff evangelist at the time, and he and a number of men in our church came and anointed my wife with oil and prayed for her in our congregation. And in the process of all of this, God began to work And I'm thankful that my wife is here with us today, and it wasn't because we prayed better than anybody else did. That was just God's plan and part of God's sovereign will for our family, because there are wonderful people who pray just as hard as we prayed, and God may have a different plan. But in our family, this is the place, an appointment that God had for us, and God did something really unusual through this bond that He put my wife in. She began to be very burdened for the health givers and for people that she came in contact with during her time at chemotherapy and in other places. And I could sit here and tell you story after story after story of people that we met as a couple that we would never have met had she not gone through cancer, that over a period of time allowed us into their life, allowed us to share the gospel, and became genuinely born again. I want to tell you the story of one of them. It was her surgeon. His name was Chip Smith. He was the nicest man I think we ever encountered in this journey with cancer. I mean, he was genuinely kind. Anytime we had a question, Chip would answer it. But every time we started to talk to Chip about the gospel, it was like window shades came down. You could just see that he was turning it on. He would talk to us about anything. It was very clear that he loved Beth, and he would do anything in the world for her. Every time he met me in town or we ran into each other, he would go out of his way to call me or to talk to me about Beth. But as soon as we started talking to him about the gospel, so one day Beth said, "Would you mind asking the church," this was on a Wednesday night, "would you mind asking the church to pray that God would begin to work in all of my caregivers, but particularly in this one?" And so we did. And over the next number of months, God began to afflict our congregation with illness. And many of those illnesses required surgery. And those people all got Chip Smith as their surgeon. So we'd go in to see or pray with the people before surgery, and Ed would walk Chip. And this just went on. It was 3 or 4 people like this. And then at the end of the year, one of our assistant pastors was stricken with something that required surgery, and lo and behold, he got Chip Smith. And so we went in to talk to Chip, or to talk to this pastor, and Chip comes in and he's like, "Man, what is with you people?" He said, "I've seen more of the insides of your church, and I haven't even been there." And so, long story short, he was invited to a Christmas outreach that we did every year, and he sort of committed to come, but he didn't show up. And this pastor had to go back because he didn't pay attention, didn't follow the doctor's orders, had to get the surgery redone. And Chip just got all on his case. "What were you doing?" And out of this guy's mouth came sort of this idea that, "Well, I was standing in a parking lot waiting for a doctor who was supposed to show up to a Christmas outreach." And it was like, boom. So Chip Smith went to lunch with this pastor and got saved. And he came to my office and he told me the whole story. The whole time you and Beth were talking to me, I didn't want to get saved, but I couldn't get away from it. That fall, Chip Smith stood in front of 400 men. Well, he got baptized a couple of months later, and that fall he stood in front of 400 men and gave his testimony. And there was a man in that congregation, in that audience, who heard Chip Smith, and he got saved. And 3 months later, I was at his funeral. There's a long story to all of this. So here's my point. What if God decided that to reach a guy like Chip Smith in your community, God was going to touch one of you with a surgery? Would you be okay with that? I mean, think about what you're going through as a body. Think about the different individuals in your congregation that are being touched with things that look like bonds. Have you ever thought, as a congregation, that this may be the very thing God is using to take the gospel forward in your town? This is what gospel communities do. This is what gospel communities think. This is how they view life together. That God is advancing the gospel through the everyday events of our life. And sometimes those events look very restrictive, don't they? So may the Lord help us as we go through life, whether it's here in your congregation or in the congregation that my wife and I are part of, that we would be part of congregations that adorn the gospel of Jesus Christ. Father,